All right, guys, can we get situated so we can start? All right, guys, let's go ahead and call the meeting to order. So can we make a motion to excuse both Rex and Chris Horton? Chris is, I believe, no longer on the chamber, so he won't be the representative on this committee. And then Rex, as you know, resigned at the end of of our last meeting when we convened. So if we can get a motion to excuse.
Are we excusing them or just accepting their resignation?
Well, we're accepting the resignation, yeah.
I'll make that motion.
So I'll second the motion to accept the resignations, if that's necessary.
He hasn't formally resigned? Okay, then we'll just make the motion just for Rex, because Chris hasn't formally resigned, my understanding. So we'll just make the acceptance for Rex.
I will amend my motion
Okay.
to accept Rex's resignation.
Okay,
I'll
all in
amend my
favor?
second. Aye.
Okay. And Chris, Keith seconded. Okay, great. Let's go to public presentation. So you'll have 3 minutes. What we'd like you to do is to go ahead and go up to the podium, because now with this new way of videotaping, you get to be front and center. So we'll start off with David.
It's facing, it is set up so facing, I thought it was facing the council, so. would be. What I wanted to speak about is suggesting that you,
Go ahead and turn the mic on. I think you
Oh.
need to turn it on. Is it on? Okay.
okay. My name is Dave Kadlachek. What I would like to speak about is suggesting that you reconsider some of the recommendations for the transition and for the and to make recommendations which I don't believe you already had regarding elections to mayor, city clerk, and chief of police to use instant runoff voting for those single-member offices, and to and to use what Steve Chesson will talk about in more detail on the called bottom-up RCV for the 2 council seats to be elected in 2018, if that's possible. For the transition issues, there's 2 things to consider. One is going to proportionality, the sooner the better, or some proportionality, at least the sooner the better, and not having things that are basically block voting at large that has all the problems that CVRA was set up to deal with, and bottom-up RCV will deal with that if it's able to be used. The other nice thing about that is one could do it using equipment that's already available and just interpreting the results slightly differently using the same equipment that San Francisco and Alameda County use for instant runoff voting in for San Francisco offices and for Berkeley, Oakland, and San Leandro offices that use instant runoff voting. So all that would be needed would be to get the county to have the software upgrade and get the same administrative permission to use it that those counties already have for stuff that's already being in use in California. To do what the actual recommendations will, for the eventual stuff will require waiting until the new voting system is obtained by the county. But and that will not happen for 2018. Hopefully it will happen for 2020. But getting the administrative permission and the software upgrade is something that is feasible. The other thing is the different transition and voter education. That will require voter education to tell people about ranking things in 2018 if that is to be used, but it'll be the same voter education that will need to be done for 2020 and later. It won't be telling them there's one thing now, something different in 2018 and something different in 2020. The only thing slightly different will be how things are counted, but how a voter will vote will be exactly the same in 2018 if bottom-up RCV is used, as will be in the future when full-blown single transferable vote, RCV, with proportional representation is used. So for those reasons, I urge you to reconsider the stuff about transition. Thank you.
Thank you. Steve?
Hi, I'm Steve Chesson, President of Californians for Electoral Reform. A couple of points. The draft amendment that was drafted by the city attorney doesn't actually describe single transferable vote. My colleague Pedro from Fair Vote is going to address that later. The draft amendment also somehow now no longer specifies how the mayor, chief of police, or city clerk should be elected, so those points need to be addressed. One of the handouts I gave you, which looks like this, are the instructions that the city of Cambridge, Massachusetts gives out to their voters to explain how their proportional system works. And I also have sample ballot, their school board sample ballot that shows what a possible STV ballot might look like. And the one for their city council was, I had to reduce it to fit on 8.5 by 11 because the full size is 8.5 by 14. But what I mainly wanted to talk about was, as Dave alluded to, is the bottom-up form of ranked choice voting. If you decide that the mayor is going to be elected in 2018 using the single winner form of ranked choice voting, sometimes called instant runoff voting, then you should also use that same ranking of the candidates in the transition election. Now, the way bottom-up works, you rank the candidates. You don't transfer any surpluses. You just eliminate from the bottom up until you have 2 people left. You have as many people left as you have seats. So, and to compare it with the other semi-proportional systems, page 1 shows, again, you've got 42 voters, 3 seats, 6 candidates, 15 voters of the A persuasion, 27 voters of the B persuasion. And of course, in an at-large election, the Bs are going to sweep the election. Turning to page 2, voters rank the candidates. So you see that an electoral minority can elect their fair share. If all the A voters rank the first A as their first choice, you sort the ballots by first choice. You then eliminate the candidate with, all the candidates with no votes, and then you eliminate the candidate with the fewest non-zero votes and resort those ballots. So after the end of round 1, the third B has the fewest votes. So turning to page 3, you would eliminate that person. Maybe half of those people put the second B as their next choice and half the other B, and then you end up with 2 Bs and an A. The nice thing about bottom up is it eliminates the vote splitting problem that the other semi-proportional systems have. If you look at page 4, you'll see that we have a vote splitting problem on the A's. But when you eliminate the lowest A, that person, their ballots get transferred to the other 2 A's. And then you now eliminate the middle A because that person now has the fewest votes. And that takes you to page 6. And so now you have 1A with 15. And then now you have to start eliminating the lowest B, and you end up with the same result, 2 Bs and an A. However, you still have the problem that if voters concentrate their votes, their rankings on too few candidates, they won't get their fair share of representation. And you'll see, for example, on page 8, the first B has 24 votes, the second B has 3. That first B will, the second B will never get enough votes to get elected. And as you continue with pages 9 and 10, you'll see that you end up with 2 A's and a B. The rest of the handout is a refresher on cumulative voting and limited voting, but my time is up. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Pedro?
My name is Pedro. I'm the Deputy Director of Fair Vote California. We're a nonprofit electoral reform organization, which is a part of Fair Vote National, an organization that's been around for 25 years working on fair representation issues. Fair Vote California is not a party to the lawsuit that you all are familiar with. But I wanted to raise a few points and bring up some things that I brought to the meeting today. I provided you with 3 handouts, one of 2 of which are model statute language from Fair Vote's website. We provide technical assistance to jurisdictions that are looking to adopt ranked choice voting. So here are 2 model statutes that we are providing here today. One of them is much shorter, which would kick it to the city council to pass an ordinance to adopt ranked choice voting. The other one is a much longer statute that would be baked into the city charter. And I also included the language of Senate Bill 1288, which was a bill that would have allowed general law cities in California to adopt ranked choice voting. It was passed with bipartisan support in the state Senate and state assembly, but it didn't become law, unfortunately. But the language is there, and a lot of vendors looked at that language when they were looking at what would ranked choice voting look like in jurisdictions. Along with that, I also wanted to talk about the options that are before you this evening. At the last city council meeting, it was tasked to the Charter Review Committee to consider, what other plans were left off the table when looking at whether it was 2 multi-member districts or at large. Both of those plans work, but I also wanted you to understand, greater context. We are here to provide assistance. We like ranked choice voting, so we'd like to see it be utilized here. So if, for some reason, or if the Charter Review Committee recommends a rotating mayor, for example, and the election goes staggered 3-4, then the threshold for exclusion when 4 seats are up, say citywide, would be 20%. So that would allow for, representation to allow for the Asian American community as well with the lower threshold. But the 3 multi-member districts does put the citizen voting age population of the Asian American community above 25%. But I just wanted to remind you all that, you're tasked with a very important job for the future of Santa Clara, and, to look at this holistically as well. Thank you for your time. And, we're here to answer any questions as well.
Thank you. Mosen? I hope I pronounced that right.
Close enough.
Okay.
Hi everyone, my name is Mohsen Mirza. I am the Voting Rights Program Coordinator at Asian Law Caucus. Earlier we sent a letter to you all addressing some of our concerns related to the process at the moment. We are certainly heartened that the city's taking this seriously and looking at and exploring the different ways in which we can expand representation on the council. Our primary concern is not with the method, but with the process with which this could be handled for voters. If Santa Clara puts an interim system in 2018 before switching to full single transferable vote in 2020, what that would do in effect is put voters through 3 dramatically different types of election systems over 3 election cycles, being the at-large system in 2016, followed by the interim system in 2018, where there would be districts, followed by 2020, where you'd finally have a ranked choice voting system, which will also happen at the same time that the county of Santa Clara is likely to transition to the vote center model under SB 450. So our recommendation is that either the city lease voting equipment to run a single transferable vote or ranked choice voting system that is that they can educate the voters to be able to use in 2018, or adopt a different ranked choice voting system, such as bottom up, that will to voters essentially feel the same, so that they are experiencing in 2018 will not feel that dramatically different from 2020. We admire the seriousness with which the city has evaluated its options in creating a voting system that enhances the voting rights of Santa Clara's diverse community, and we look forward to continuing to provide input to the city on this important process. I will be here for the remainder of the meeting, and we are happy to discuss and engage with you all beyond this as well. So thank you for being here, and thank you for your time.
Thank you. Is there any member of the audience that would like to speak that didn't bring up a speaker card? Okay. Let's go to item 3, is the approval of the revised minutes from June 26th and the draft minutes from July 10th.
Make a motion to approve the minutes.
Okay, there's a motion to approve. Mark has seconded. Is there,
Question, what I was trying to find what the revisions to the July minutes were.
Go ahead.
The June minutes, the first set.
So the revision is actually, it's just a, really kind of a formatting issue where the matters for council action was, what you see right now, matters for council action was not included in the version of the minutes that you had approved at the last meeting. So this was included in the body, and it just was not included at the top. So
Okay, thank you.
Jody? That was my question. Okay. Is there any other discussion? Call for the vote. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? So it's unanimous. Abstain? And Hazel abstained. So, okay. Let's move on to item 4, review and approve the draft charter amendment related to the election of city council members. So I will pass to the city attorney to start this conversation.
Oh, this is different, okay. I'm an old guy, what can I say? Good evening, Chair and committee members. I have drafted, to the best of my ability, a document which is in your materials, which would be the proposed charter language. Let's go through the easy parts first, and then we can get to the hard part and have a discussion of that part. The easy part is, number one, on the first page, I'm just simply noting that if the charter amendment passes, then the city council will have to amend ordinance Santa Clara Municipal Code Section 2.10.010, which states that it currently states it's the city council is the governing body of the city whose members shall be elected from the city at large for a term of 4 years. So I would just recommend to the city council they simply strike that section and just simply say, at the times and in the manners as provided in the new sections 700.1 and 700.2 of the charter. So it would just simply refer to the charter for the terms and how the city council members are elected. Okay, the next section.
May I interrupt for questions
Sure.
as we go through?
Yeah.
Because we aren't using any system that would limit the number of years in a term, even during the transition period, would there be a reason for you to not just include the words for a term of 4 years? And just remove that strike at large?
I thought we were electing one council member for a 2-year term.
Oh, sorry, you are correct in that terms. That's right.
Sure.
Oh, I'm sorry. Is there a limit to how often you can change the charter? Like if we were to make a change, would that preclude us from making another change for a set period of time?
Only given the length of life. The charter can only be amended every 2 years at a general election. So either in a presidential year or in a gubernatorial year.
Okay, so a change.
With very, very limited exceptions, but generally speaking, it's only at an election of the voters at the general election in November.
Okay.
The next section that would be amended would be section 600. And again, I'm just eliminating the words "at large" in the second paragraph. I don't know if you can see that. Now, we might have to change that around a little depending on we may have to change that around a little because it depends on what we would do with the office of the mayor, the chief of police, and the city clerk. Whether we're sticking with at large with them, whether, I guess on the work plan, there's a suggestion about considering whether to put on a ballot amendment to eliminate the chief of police and the city clerk as elective offices. So depending on what is recommended on that other parts, we may have to change some of the language here. but I'm just simply noting that section 600 would have to be amended in some fashion. Yes.
So in the third paragraph that says, "The person receiving the most votes cast for a particular city office shall be declared duly elected." But if you have, if it's a vote for 3, my understanding is it would be possible for like the second place person that in the course of the reshuffling of votes, they might not end up winning. And so they might start out with more votes than somebody else and end up, the other person ending up winning. So I'm not sure if it is really true. The person, since you're voting for 3.
Yeah, I guess it
doesn't
depends.
really mean that the person receiving the most votes for a particular office.
Okay, I see your point, and we may want to change that language a little bit too, depending on how we, what we could do is just eliminate it from this section and refer to the other section of how you elect. So it doesn't necessarily have to be in both sections, but we may have to, I'm not sure how we would deal with ties. I'm not sure if we've ever had a tie, but we may need to.
But it is still possible to have a tie.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure with the ranked choice voting, you can have a tie.
It is.
You can?
Well, if two people voted, they voted for the same candidates, you have a tie. You can't have a tie. I mean, from a simplistic point of view, if 2 people voted and they voted for 2 different people.
Well, no,
you have
I'm
a
talking
tie.
about in a real election. I mean,
Well, you could have
Well,
500 people vote for one person and 500 vote for another, and 600 vote for another one, then how do
Mathematically,
you?
you can have a tie. So
You can have a
have to have
tie.
some way to deal with
okay, so
ties.
we would have to have but we could just do that by ordinance.
So can I suggest that we remove the first sentence and leave the second
Yeah.
sentence? Thank you.
And then looking back up, just because we,
Sorry, I think you refer to ties in the next section anyway, so you might, if you just remove the whole thing, if I'm not mistaken, I think you refer to how ties are handled in the next section in 700.2. Yeah, so I mean, if you want to remove the whole thing and just
Okay.
address ties with the rest of everything, that should be fine too.
all right, what we'll do is as we go through this, I'll make notes, and then I will read back to you the edits that you've made, and then you can incorporate that into whatever motion you'd like.
So in the other section, it says that ties are resolved according to state law, and this first one says they're resolved by ordinance. Do you know which it is?
Where is this?
So in your new 700.2, F, a tie between 2 or more candidates shall be resolved in accordance with state law. I don't think that's true. I think it is by ordinance, isn't it?
Well, let me get to the, we'll get to that section when I get to it, okay?
Okay.
Okay.
So should we remove it from section 600 then?
Leah, let's, whatever we do with ties, let's do all in section 700.2,
Okay.
okay?
Take it out of this section.
Yeah, we'll take it, the
whole
whole
paragraph.
The whole middle paragraph out. Okay. Those are all the comments or the edits I have right now for section 600. Section 700.1. Does anyone have any more comments on section 600? All right, section.
I just a quick clarification. We are like sort of putting a pin in the fact that we may make changes and or need to be clear about how we're going to elect the mayor and other single officers.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
Purposes
in
of today's meeting.
600?
Yeah.
I'm actually, as I reread it, I think it's okay to just cross out "at large," because then the sentence becomes "at the
Right.
times and in the manner provided for in this charter."
Right. So,
So-
then that'll make sense for this, and
Yeah.
then we may later have a new.
If we do something else with the mayor or other offices, then we can just deal with it in those sections.
Perfect. Thanks.
Okay, section 700.1. The first thing we're doing is eliminating designation of seats from the title, because we're no longer doing that anymore. And so then all the rest of it is new. So I didn't redline it from the way it is now because it just would have been too busy. So this is all new language. And this is pretty much as you directed. So I pretty much took all the language that you came up with in terms of having 2 districts and how we would do the voting for the elections to those districts. And then the method of elections is in 700.2.
So I have questions about 700.1.
Sure.
So first of all, you've designated the 2 districts as A and B, and most places, districts are numbered, like in San Jose, they have District 1, District 2, District 3. So I'm wondering why, in fact, everywhere else that I know of, the districts are numbered. So I was just wondering about the reasoning behind.
Only because that's the terminology you guys used.
We did.
I'm
And
completely neutral. You could
We
call
used
them.
A and B because the seats currently have numbers and we
You-
didn't want to be.
You could call them orange and black, you could call them blue and gold, you could call them Harvey and Mildred, whatever you want to call them, you can call them.
Okay,
I kind of like that.
now would be the time to decide, and I'm just wondering if, since everyone else seems to number their districts, if this is where we want to stake a difference. I would stick
I'm a
with
firm
numbers.
believer that in matters of taste, that the majority should rule. Whatever terminology the group votes to have, I will follow. I have no opinion on it whatsoever.
Does anyone have any
Can
opinion?
we-
I would
can-
go with
can-
numbers. and
Sorry,
that's-
can we defer until we know whether the districts are going to be north, south, east, or west? Because there could be a distinction that if you start numbering it, that there's an expectation that you're going to add numbers, or that District 1 is first and District 2 is second, you know what I mean?
But with A and B, you have that same
I know.
thing.
That's why I'm saying if we wait until we know where the district lines are drawn, that you can be referred to as the North District and the South District, or East and West, or.
Well, I would be really concerned about having them be named based on geography, because
So
then
would I.
that sort of implies that you can't change them,
Okay.
right? What if a North District became,
And presumably, we are not going to draw
We're
the
not drawing it right
districts
now.
No.
until after this charter amendment passes.
Right.
right? That's why I would keep them generic. I'm just suggesting numbers instead of.
So how many
letters.
people would,
Rod?
Mr. Chair, may I? It's important to note. There we go. Okay, it's important to note also that going with a numbered district will avoid some confusion on the ballot. Right now, when you have measures, you have measure A, B, C, D. That's the way the county goes through it. So having city council seat A, B, if you have a big campaign for a measure A and B at the same time, then the district terminology versus the measure terminology may get a bit confusing there. And there won't be direct overlap, but to the mind of a voter who's looking at it, there may be inference. So that in fact would probably have some more clarity for the average voter.
okay. So do we have to take a formal vote to change this language, or can we just do a straw poll and say how many want 1 and 2 versus A and B?
However you want to do it is fine.
Okay, let's take a straw poll. So how many want the districts named A and B versus 1 and 2? Okay, so let's change the language to districts 1 and 2, unless, Steve, you had something else?
Yeah, I would just suggest it's probably a council decision more than ours.
Yeah, but we have to make the recommendation to council. So we'll recommend to council District 1, District 2. Thank you.
Okay, and I had one more comment on this section. Letter E is talking about from 2024 on, they get elected to 4-year terms. I think you can just strike that one, because in D, you're already saying from 2022 on, they're 4-year terms each.
I would actually suggest that you eliminate D and then just change E to 2022.
Except don't you need
Would
to
make it a lot
say
simpler.
in 2022
Yes,
which district they're coming from?
doesn't matter, right? It's just in each election starting from 2022, you're electing 3 council members for 4 years each. D is extra here, it's not necessary. It's being specific about 2022 and it's the same as every other year after it. It's achieving the same effect that you're saying,
I see what
Jody.
you mean.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. I would just suggest that eliminate D. Oh, sorry.
Did you put that just because I see that after C, you still get, it's still kind of in the transition period. So after E, it's the full, like rotation of what's actually happening.
That's why I did. I want it to be super clear.
Okay, that's
But,
how I see
I mean,
it.
I realize it is somewhat repetitive, but, you know, I think for the average person reading it, it just makes it super clear that there's only one council member elected once for a 2-year term.
I mean, I would say leave it because, I mean, it describes from, like I said, the transition period, I guess, ends in 2020, and then in 2022, it's the first cycle, and then 2024, you see the second half of that cycle. So I think it's a lot more clear that way.
I'm fine with that. Okay, then I had one more,
Sorry, you're fine with what? Just with leaving it as is?
leaving it as is. Are you okay with that?
If it makes it more clear for people, it achieves the same thing. I thought reducing the number of letters or bullets would make it more clear, but Marcus, if you think it's going to keep it like the way it is more clear, that's fine for me. I'm just in the interest of whatever makes it more clear for whoever's reading it.
Yeah, no, I just believe you see the full cycle from the transition period to the two sides of, okay, one election cycle, you're going to get District A or 1 to have 3 council members elected for 4 years. And then the next election cycle, the other district's going to get 3. And you kind of just see the full.
Understand.
Yeah,
I think that's actually a good point.
Okay, so let's go ahead, Jody, move on.
Okay, sorry, I have 2 more. So the next one was that since the mayor is part of council, as we've said in previous sections, but they're not part of this at the moment, and we may talk about that, but I think that there needs in this section to be a reference to the mayor and how they're getting elected. Because because in the original, I'm looking at the original language of the charter section, and it says, it talks about the council seat, that the mayor is effectively council seat number 1, and then the others are numbered from 2 through 7. So now you've lost
Where does
any
it say
reference to the mayor.
In the
Is
current
there-
charter.
In the current charter, 700.1,
Is there something, a subsequent?
I think that there's
the
like
mayor?
a very easy fix for this, because I think you're exactly right, Jody, that it should probably be something, but I think we could say members of this, at the very beginning, the intro paragraph, members of the city council, comma, other than the mayor, comma, and then go on. And because to be determined yet how we're going to handle the mayor, and I don't think that it necessarily has to be all in one section. There's lots of mayor-specific sections of the council charter, I mean, of the city charter already.
and then.
And then to be determined later if we change anything about how the mayor is elected.
But we need to have something that states how we're electing the mayor.
Yes, I think it should be in its own section that is yet to be
Yeah,
drafted.
if we deal with
Yes.
the mayor, then it's going to be in a separate charter section.
Right.
But I'm
so
okay, I'm okay with adding other than the mayor, just to be super clear.
Okay, we just need to make sure that we deal with it, because if we don't change how we elect the mayor, we still need to add something in about how we're electing the mayor, because there's nothing right now that says how to
Okay,
elect
so is
the
there a
mayor.
straw poll on adding anything other than the mayor? Is there any opposition to it? Okay, then let's go ahead and make that change.
Okay, and then the other one I had was, when I was looking at the original charter language, about halfway through in the section after it talks about the different seat numbers, there's this sentence that says, "The designation so given to each such office shall thereafter be used in all election, nomination papers, certificates of election, and other election papers pertaining or referring to such office, and to designate incumbency in such office." And I think that sentence needs to stay in there at some point, because it's saying that once you're in District 1 or District 2, that you need to use that in your flyers and in your incumbency and such. Does that make sense?
What are you reading from? Because we're a little
The
confused.
original charter, the current charter that's in your book.
What number?
700.1,
Okay.
the same section that we're looking at. Because he's talking about replacing what's currently in our charter with this new language, and I wanted to make sure that there was nothing in the old section, the original section, that wasn't getting lost in this transition. So everything here in our current charter either needs to be struck or needs to be kept. And so I felt like this was a sentence that we needed to keep.
So,
Could
so
you
what do
repeat
you
the
want to
sentence
keep
you want
from
to
it?
keep?
It's the sentence, it's about halfway through, right after the seat numbers are listed, that says, "The designation so given to each such office," so it's saying which district you're in or which seat you're in, "shall thereafter be used in all election nomination papers, certificates of election, and other election papers." Do you see where I'm reading?
Yeah, I understand that, but I'm not so sure you want to do that. Because if
Well-
someone moves from one district to another, they're not going to keep that.
No, but my take was, is if somebody's running in District 1, just like if they're running for seat number 2 now, then everything that they mention, like in terms of their election, they're going to be saying, "I'm running for seat number 2, and I'm telling the registrar I'm running for seat number 2. And when I'm the incumbent of seat number 2. Well, now it's going to be, "I'm running in District 1, and I am going to be the incumbent in District 1, and all of my paperwork needs to say I'm in District 1." Just like on the school board, I have to say I'm trustee area 2 in all of my paperwork.
But why does it matter? I mean, because you're not having the districts running against each other at the same time. You're just saying, "I'm running for city council." And then if you get it on your ballot that you can vote for the person, you can vote for the person. If not, it's not your year to vote.
No, but you have to list the exact thing that you're running
Which
for.
city council? You're just running for city council. You're not running for a seat number. And you can only run for your district, and people can only vote in your district. So, and the districts won't vote at the same time. So in this case, a school board, people are voting for the different districts at the same time. So you specify which district number you're running for so as to not, somebody's not looking at the ballot and says, "Well, wait a second, I can't," well, actually in school board, you can vote for all districts. But anyways, you know what I'm saying, that the districts are running at the same time. In our case, the districts don't run at the same time. So if you just say, "I'm running for city council," that's all
I'm
that
thinking the
matters.
registrar is, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Good, Mary.
I think Rod actually goes first. Oh, I was just apparently not doing a very good job with the microphone. I'm just sort of confused as to whether or not this is something that's necessary to be in the charter, in the sense that isn't there already governing like state law or ordinances that could cover this, or maybe already did? Like, it may have been superfluous in the first place in the city charter.
If I may, the process that we follow when we issue nomination papers is such that we are actually obligated to indicate the offices somebody's running for in all of the nomination papers. You've got a whole slew of them that range from accepting the voluntary campaign expenditure pledge to actually having your nomination paper issued to doing your oath of office. And the point at which it becomes particularly important, I believe, is the point at which you do your oath of office, because at that point you are going to have indicated that you represent a particular geographic area, rather than simply being a council member. Because if you sign an oath of office saying, "I'm a council member for the city of Santa Clara," and it's not specific, then it's not necessarily codified anywhere that that was the seat that you ran for and that was the seat that you were actually elected to in the mind of the registrar of voters. Additionally, up in the dais, you'll have, of course, it'll indicate which seat you're from. But also from a historical context, if you go back and try and look, okay, what was somebody running for? What was that election cycle for? And you're going back 20 years from now to do that type of research, simply from a functional point of view, having the seat indicated on it at the time will save somebody a whole lot of extrapolation to figure out who was running for what seat at which time. So there are some practical reasons why you may want to include that, as long as it's not contrary to any type of law. And I'll defer to the city attorney on that, both from a practical standpoint and perhaps also a legal standpoint, depending on whether or not that oath of office is required to indicate which seat they're elected to.
But we're not running for seats. I mean, unless you're suggesting that you would explicitly say City Council District 1, City Council District 2, but not indicating a particular seat.
I'm sorry, District 1,
Oh,
District 2.
okay. So
Sorry,
that's what you're
District
referring-
seat would be, I shouldn't use interchangeably.
Okay.
Correct, so it would be a
Okay.
district.
So you're suggesting that that would be relevant in the record-keeping portion as well, and as part of the oath of office, that you would say that which district you...
We do now indicate which district which seat they're elected to. In this case, district would follow suit. And again, I don't know that that's a legal requirement or not, but it certainly is far more clear where it comes to the public's perception of who does what, and also the understanding of the council member.
Mary? And then Chris.
I mean,
Keith.
as a policy matter, I don't think it's a problem to include something like what Jody is suggesting. I just was feeling like it might be superfluous, that it may already be required when you go to the Register of Voters, when you do all of these pieces by other, like the city charter might not be why we're doing it that way.
I would suspect that the state elections code probably has something similar to this, but I don't think it's necessary to put in the charter. We could certainly do it by ordinance. So I'd prefer not to try to put it into the charter, because the more things you put in the charter, the harder it is to fix if you make even the slightest error. And I'd rather just not have it in there if we don't have to. What we could do is maybe for now, let's not put it back in, because I'm really not comfortable doing this on the fly like this. And then I'll do a little research as to what the state elections code already says. And we can come back with you to you if we think you really need to put it back in. We can come back and recommend doing that.
That's great. I appreciate that.
Any other comment? Okay, you want to move forward?
Or comments on section 700.1?
Yeah, so why in F? In F you state the method by which districts are to be drawn and redrawn, and the method of voting for city council shall be enacted by ordinance. Why would you keep "and the method of voting"? Why wouldn't you just strike those 5 words? Because we're talking about method of voting in the charter, not in an ordinance.
Okay.
You would just say the method by which districts are to be drawn and redrawn shall be enacted by ordinance of the city council. F, section 700.1 F.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I guess at the time I wrote this, I was hoping we could just do it all in an ordinance, but I did actually give you a charter provision. And then tonight, it was suggested to me that it might well be better to do by ordinance. But let's take it out of this section and the method of voting. So let's just say the method by which districts are to be drawn and redrawn for city council shall be enacted by ordinance of the city council.
Right.
So let's do all the district drawing via ordinance, because that's not good to do in the charter, because you're going to have to change it after every census anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So we should have something flexible.
Yeah. I just wanted to strike those 5
So
words.
take out F?
Yeah, I'm fine with that.
Take out the 5 words which are "and the method of voting." So the F would state, the method by which districts are to be drawn and redrawn for city council shall be enacted by ordinance of the city council.
Yes. Okay, here comes the meat of the matter here. I'm going to be honest with you. I just basically paraphrased San Francisco's charter provision, because I didn't really know where to begin to how to describe this in words. I mean, we have a lot of charts, we have a lot of this and that, and so I figured since people had spoken highly of San Francisco, I would copy them. But I don't claim to be an expert on how to describe this. So we may not need to or want to fully reword this tonight. One suggestion that has been made to me before the meeting was, do it in an ordinance. Describe how you want to vote in an ordinance. I like that idea. The reason I didn't put it in here as simply, do this in an ordinance is because I wasn't sure that's what you wanted to do. The reason I like just saying, we're going to have ranked choice voting and describe generally what ranked choice voting is and have the city council pass the ordinances. If we make a mistake or we don't write it that well or we realize there's a problem with it, it's so much harder to change the charter than it is to just amend an ordinance. So if you could come up with language that adequately ties the city council and future city councils to a particular method of voting in your minds, that it might be a better recommendation back to the council. having said that, I'll listen to whatever you have to say about what I came up with in terms of draft language.
So,
I think Hassan gave you a peace offering. I can see something, a peace offering coming sometime in the future. Oh, well, thank you. That is not saying a lot.
awesome.
I am hungry. I'm kidding. Go ahead.
I like the idea of the charter amendment saying just, something like we got from Fair Vote this very simple version that just says, we'll do ranked choice voting, also known as single transferable vote, and then the city council will do it by ordinance. That appeals to me, I think, for a lot of probably the same reasons it appeals to Brian. Both it's simple and people then can kind of know what it is, but it's also that then we don't have, the bastions of lawyers, like myself, coming in later to litigate over whether or not we're precisely following exactly what's in the charter provision. So like, one, if we made a mistake, it's hard to fix. But two, even if we didn't make a mistake, but people have different interpretations of it, that's more easily worked out in a city council meeting and an ordinance than I think through the charter amendment process. So I would be in favor of, I think you did overall a good job. We can go through this nitpicky things if we want, and I'm happy to do that. But I overall would be in favor of doing the more simple charter provision and having city council pass the ordinance.
Quick question, if this were to go on the charter, would all of this have to be on the ballot?
Yes, every word that's in the charter amendment would be on the ballot. So what you have is a ballot question.
Yeah.
And then you have the attachment would be the actual ballot language.
I would.
It's not on the ballot.
No, I understand that.
No,
I mean, it's on the literal
it is in the
ballot.
ballot booklet.
No, I understand that.
It's not on the ballot itself. You're right. The ballot question is in the ballot booklet. I mean, is in the ballot itself. So there's a ballot question, which would have to summarize what the amendments are.
I got all that. I understand all that. And that's what I meant. I didn't think this was going to go on the actual ballot. But I agree with what Mary is saying, is that something simple is infinitely better than something this complex, because we've been studying this for months, and we're still going to go through this and have our questions and so on and so forth. And, I do agree with the notion that, you are going to have a group of people, regardless, that are going to be critical. And the more you give them to be critical of, the more headaches we're going to have. So I think from a charter perspective, simple is better. And then from an ordinance perspective, I do agree with the city attorney that if there's something that we go back and we conclude that it could be written different, or we forgot something, or we need to strike something, it's going to be infinitely easier than having to go back and try to change the charter itself. So Keith, and then Hassan.
My only question, I guess, for you would be is, I kind of think city council is required to follow the reasonable definition of words, and the city council can't define single transferable vote as something vastly different from what we have studied as single transferable vote by ordinance.
And you could even add, if you wanted to, you could add a definition. For example, in Fair Vote's model statute, they have a section 2 where they have a definition of ranked choice voting.
Okay, well, I'm kind of asking for a
so what
legal
I'm saying,
advice. Is
what I'm saying
if
is,
you say they can't do it, then I'm fine. But if
no,
they
I mean,
can pass an ordinance that
no,
says
they can't.
pi is
They can't. But to
4,
the extent you don't define it, then it gives them it makes it less clear as to what you mean by ranked choice voting. So what I would say is try to stick to like one paragraph, something like, members of the city council shall be elected by ranked choice voting, also known as single transferable vote. I mean, this is one model statutory language. The city council shall by ordinance establish the ballot format and rules for casting and counting the votes. Now, that doesn't actually define ranked choice voting, also known as single transferable vote. We've also had this notion of bottom up. So I don't know if you want to put that concept into the charter or leave that to the ordinance. So it depends on, I would be more than more than comfortable with, a single paragraph generally describing what you mean, and then leaving it to the city council with enough guidance that they would pass an ordinance to carry out the wishes of the charter.
Okay, thank you.
Lisbon?
That was kind of along the lines of what I was going to ask, is I also like the shortened version, but to play devil's advocate, like what Keith said, if the council has the total flexibility to say ranked choice voting is throwing darts on a wall and whoever gets the highest number is the higher ranked choice, then that's not what we intended for it to be. So I think if we, sorry, I couldn't think of another better analogy. But I mean, I like the shortened language. I think maybe it behooves us to add an additional paragraph to just explain what the textbook definition is of a single transferable vote, where candidates are ranked on the ballot in order of preference, and then candidates are eliminated in a methodical way until candidates exceed the threshold by which they are elected into the office. And something simple like that, and then you could continue with the sentence that says, the council shall do it by ordinance.
So would you be able to have that language by the next meeting, that short paragraph for us to review?
Sure.
Okay, so let's go ahead and do that, see what it looks like, and then we can go from there. Sorry, Teresa.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions about that. One, is it not a little premature to be thinking about changing the language since we're doing a stepped-up change into the new voting system? So you're going to be changing the charter, but it won't be implemented until after the next voting cycle?
Well,
And then the other question that I had was, if you just did it by ordinance, is it a possibility that a sitting council sometime down the road could decide to change back without a public process?
Well, passing an ordinance is a public process, and
they can't eliminate that.
and you
They
can't pass an ordinance that's in violation of the charter. I mean, it just,
But could they retract the order that if we chose to do an ordinance rather than a change of charter, is it I'm just asking the question because I don't know the
no,
answer.
as long as the charter adequately defined and limited the method of election to something that's pretty easily subject to analyzation. I mean, obviously, throwing darts at a board is not ranked choice voting. So, I mean, and at large is obviously not ranked choice voting. So, I mean,
So it's pretty solid. Is
it's
what you're
pretty
saying.
solid,
Okay.
and I think it gives them the flexibility. You may want to give some kind of guidance to, implementation timelines. If, depending on what the registrar of voters is capable of doing, for example, in 2018. In other words, do this in 2018 unless you can't, and then do this.
Yeah.
But then they would be able to, closer to the election and closer to discussions with the registrar of voters, be able to, by ordinance, actually apply that.
Mary? I'm sorry, Teresa, are we done? Okay, Mary.
On to the point about transition, I think one of the things that's nice about having a shorter piece and saying, ranked choice voting, also known as single transferable vote, and allowing it to be done by ordinance, it then gives the city council the power, should we want to recommend it, for them to say in 2018, what we mean by ranked choice voting is this bottom-up thing that potentially our county registrar can do, and then in 2020, what we mean by single transferable vote is what we want it to actually be. So they then have that flexibility without having to change the charter.
The charter. Because the charter can only be changed every 2 years.
Right.
So this, like
I mean,
said,
otherwise we need to write it into the charter that there'll be a transition on the methods of voting, which I think we can do as well, but is currently missing.
And if you look at what the sample language that was given to us, there's a section 2 that says effective date. It says this act shall go into effect, blah, blah, blah. I mean, we can probably reword a version of I.
So
that
so,
would
so why don't we let the city attorney, we won't have to problem solve it now, but let the city attorney or take it offline with him and let the city attorney figure out what it's going to look like, and then we can go through it. And because I want to get to Jody, and we're going to really run out of time tonight. We've already gone for an hour, unless you're really adamant about sharing this and you really want to let the city
No, I
attorney
was just
know.
suggesting, along what Mary said, that something like I that says this should be implemented as soon as it's available by the
Right.
registrar with the intention of doing it by 2020 or whatever.
And you got
Something like
that, right, city attorney?
You want to put,
So a version of I, like you would add a paragraph that said, this act or this new method shall go in effect, and then some
It's a
version of
contingent
I that
upon-
does it, yeah.
sure, we can do that.
Yeah, so it's a contingency, so to speak. Okay, Jody?
Well, why don't we
Oh.
focus on I, because I don't know if people notice this or not.
Well, let Jody has a comment, and then we'll go.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead, Jody.
Well, two comments, and one of them was about I, but my first comment was, and it makes more sense now that you say that you've copied this from San Francisco, because in G, you mentioned a Department of Elections, and maybe San Francisco has that within their city, but
Right,
we don't have any control over the
I
registrar.
forgot to change that one.
Yeah, so I don't think we need to have anything in the charter about how we're going to educate, because we have a city clerk who
Okay.
does our education for us. So I think you can remove, when you rewrite this, we can remove any references to how the training is going to happen.
Most of it will be gone.
Okay, good. And then in I noticed that you talk about a runoff election at the very end of section I, and we decided not to do a runoff. We were just going to do a plurality. So when you're rewriting I,
That's correct, yeah.
we shouldn't have a runoff in December.
So we're just going to do basically an at-large election.
Yep.
A plurality.
Well, it's a
For
plurality
2018?
election.
For
within-
2018.
Plurality within the districts.
So you vote for two. And then the two
The
largest
top
vote
two
getters.
vote getters are elected
those
by a
seats.
plurality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay,
That was the motion that we made at one of our
Okay.
previous meetings.
So city attorney, you can go ahead if you want to continue to discuss. Aye.
no, that was the only part of I that I was going to bring up was the idea of a runoff, because that at least preserves the idea of, that each candidate would have to get a majority of the vote, that it would be the top two out of a field, there would only be two, you're at the point, it's like an instant runoff, but it's not, it's the old version. It's a not so instant runoff. It is a true runoff. Since you were interested in the idea of a runoff, if you couldn't do a runoff in a single ballot, I just suggested you may want to revert back to actually having a runoff, but if you don't want to do that, that's fine.
Well, it would be hard anyways because you're voting for two. So you can't just put two people up in the runoff because you're voting for two. So you'd need more than two in
Right.
your runoff. And I don't quite
Technically,
understand
you
what that
would
would
need
look
two
like.
runoffs to actually accommodate that, which would be a nightmare.
Well, and how do you figure out which, yeah,
Yeah, it would be a nightmare to do two
And I don't think
runoffs.
we want to put candidates through that.
Sorry?
I don't think we want to put candidates through that. at
I
this-
wouldn't want to put voters through that.
Unless you can
Candidates,
really,
they could deal with it.
unless you're great at fundraising. Yeah, Mary.
Though I would say that, at the beginning of our meeting, several of the public presentations were sort of specifically about I and how we should not be doing it this way. That instead we should consider whether or not there's a way to do some form of ranked choice voting in 2018. And so I don't know if we can go ahead and transition to that, or if we have something else to talk about in this before we transition to that, but it seems like something worth discussing, whether or not there, because I think we all, when we made the motions before to make this recommendation to council, it was based on the assumption that there was just no way to do ranked choice voting in 2018, and I think we have a couple of groups coming in to say, like, actually, maybe there is a way that the city can do ranked choice voting in 2018. And I don't know if we're right, if they're right about that, and I'm happy to hear.
Well, I mean, one of the suggestions I heard was to actually lease some voting equipment from San Francisco or something
I don't
like
understand
that.
how they would lease equipment if they
I'm
need to
just
use
not,
it.
since we wouldn't be doing the leasing and it would be a registrar of voters, I'm just not sure that we would be
Yeah,
in a position to recommend that.
yeah.
Agreed, but there was a second suggestion that seemed more implementable, perhaps, and so.
So I want to comment a little bit, because we got even a letter sent to us. I don't know if you guys saw it in your email, and I think some copies were provided over there. Just for the clarification of the public, the registrar of voters did come over and talk to us at length for, I think, a couple hours, and told us what we can and can't, like what is feasible in 2018 and what isn't. And I think the concept of leasing voting machines, I know that's not the right words to be used, but that concept was presented to us by our registrar of voters. In other words, San Francisco does it, Alameda County does it. There is an extent, just to summarize what we talked about in that long meeting, to be able to certify Santa Clara County's system to be able to accommodate ranked choice between June, when this charter amendment would go up on the ballot, and then let's say hopefully it passes, between June and then in November, actually you have to do all the ballot work before November. The window is extremely tight, and it's not feasible to be able to certify the equipment in that short amount of time. So that was what I got out of that, and if people are nodding their heads, I think they kind of got the same sense from the presentation from the registrar.
Yep.
What I do want to ask for clarification from whoever can give it in the public is there was a notion that given our current balloting system, we could do bottom-up RCV with like a hack. I'm reluctant to do hacks, but I'm curious as if it would be easily followable. If we're just rehashing stuff that we debated 3 months ago,
We did.
I don't want to go there again.
We actually talked about this, and what we agreed upon was that we're not going to give the council something that would be, well, if we could hack this, or if we could get that, or if this, and this were to happen. We agreed that we were going to give the council something concrete that they could work with, and I would argue that a hack or a workaround is probably not something that they're going to want to support, because there's no data that says, you know, we can do it. So I would.
Can I seek clarification from the members or member of the public who suggested that option, just to clarify, like
problem.
whether or
Steve?
not it's something we heard in the past, or if this is something that we haven't heard of before? Do you mind, Chair? Okay.
Check. If you go back to the presentation that the registrar gave you, I believe the staff person from the registrar said that if they got approval from the Secretary of State, they could conduct ranked choice voting, which would be in a bottom-up fashion, with the current equipment that they have, because we use the same equipment that San Francisco uses. They would have to get the software upgrade that San Francisco uses. They'd have to get administrative approval from the Secretary of State, but they could do a ranked choice voting election, not single transferable vote. But once you get down to the last two candidates, that's basically effectively bottom up. So if they got administrative approval and the software upgrade from the vendor, and administrative approval from the Secretary of State to use it, then they could do a 2018. You could do like the mayor using single winner ranked choice voting, and you could fill those 2 seats using bottom-up ranked choice voting.
Okay, so that's basically what the registrar presented to us. That's the bottom-up RCV.
Yeah, we didn't introduce the concept of bottom-up RCV at the
Understand,
time,
but it's the same.
but it effectively would be. Yeah.
Okay.
Can I clarify?
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead, Jody.
And I believe Mr. Kadlec.
Well, I wanted to
gave a
clarify,
correction.
though, in my notes from when the registrar was here, it says if they got the software upgrade.
Right.
And if they got the approval, you could only get a maximum of 3 choices.
3 rankings.
3 rankings.
This is true.
So you couldn't rank everyone, only the top 3.
Well, that's true. That's the way the elections work in San Francisco and Oakland. When you have 20 people running for office, you only get to rank 3.
Okay.
But it is still better than plurality.
So the question I have to the committee.
Hossam, I think Mr. Kadlec would like to
Okay.
add to what
Sorry.
I said, or correct a mistake I may have made.
It's not so much correcting a mistake as adding something that Steve forgot to do. The question about how long it will take to get the approvals, if the city indicates to the registrar that they want to get, that they're considering doing it, the county could begin the process of requesting the approval to use it, which they may or may not need to actually use very soon. They wouldn't have to wait until after a charter amendment passes in June to begin requesting that. So it's so if they request next month, it's not for sure that it would be approved in time, but it's a lot more likely that it would than if they wait until June to do so.
Right. So I wanted to remind the committee that we've gone over this thoroughly.
That's why
we've gone over this, and again, and thank you for reminding us that again, it wasn't a matter of will; it was a matter of timing. And we didn't want to give something to the council that was contingent upon a number of things having to happen in order for us to be able to do it. And that's why we stayed with and voted on the method that we did, because there was an issue with, and there was no guarantee that the state would be able to do it. And there were a lot of other things that could or could not happen. And so in order to have something solid to give to the council, although we would like to have something different, I think everybody agreed we'd like to have something different in 2018, the timing just wasn't going to work. It just wasn't practical to do that. So is there any, did somebody else have their hand up? Keith, yeah, sorry.
I mean, I guess I would echo those same things. I think a June election doesn't get certified until June 20th or, near the end of June, because I think it's 2 weeks. And I mean, people pull papers to run and start campaigning in spring, non-officially, and you can start raising money for what you're running for before July. And the notion of, well, we don't know if they're going to approve changing voting mechanisms, so I'm going to campaign this way and then switch to that way sometime in July or August, to me seems very, not quite unfair, but very difficult to deal with for the people that are running in a situation where they're already running in a district. And I think what we came up with was a compromise. What we suggested can be handled by the current voting system. We've just made the precinct half the size it used to be.
Right. I think Marcus and I think back at that time, we were talking about, of course, we want, the citizens come first, but then we thought about the candidates. And so when you run a campaign, right, to get to that primary, you have to spend X amount of dollars, right? Well, if you have a grassroots campaign and, you're not getting big dollars thrown into your campaign, then, you have to get to that point. And then if you get to that point, then you have to completely re-strategize with a whole nother campaign, paradigm or whatever. And that's almost like, sort of like running twice. So it would be difficult. Again, it's not impossible. It's not that, that's why we shouldn't do it. But for candidates, you want the best candidates to run. And I think that would be kind of a hindrance, especially to those that don't have the ability to raise a lot of money from certain organizations and so on and so forth. So Marcus and then Mary.
Didn't we bring this up and Rod had mentioned something about the time filing papers or pulling papers kind of coordinated with that? Was there an issue there? I don't know.
If this occurs as a charter change in the June election cycle, the time where you would pull nomination papers is usually mid-July you'll start, so that we would have a very short time frame to pull together any of the paperwork that needed to happen to implement that process. In fact, it's important to remember that the registrar's office has 30 days from the election to actually certify the results. They give that canvas to us, then we receive it. So while, say we have an election on June 2nd, 3rd, something, whatever that is, they would have until 30 days after that. It gets to us in early July. It's even a shorter time frame to actually implement the changes. But you'll know what the changes were for the most part ahead of time on election day, unless it's a really, really close race. If it's within a half of a percentage point, you might not. But for the most part, you're going to know one way or another well before then, and to be able to anticipate what you need to put into place. The bigger question is whether or not you draw district lines ahead of time or you draw them afterward. And if you do in fact have to draw district lines afterward, that becomes a much more difficult process to incorporate into the upcoming election cycle following in the November of 2018 timeframe. In fact, there are best practices that are laid out in certain new elements of law, which unfortunately relate primarily, in fact, only to general law cities, but that charter cities can use as benchmarks for the timing in which that would happen. And I don't believe that that few week time period would allow for that to happen effectively. So you would need to come up with how you're going to tackle the actual drawing of district lines ahead of time to be able to have those in place one way or another.
The other thing that would also be difficult about going that way and just kind of hanging our fate at how well or not well the registrar of voters or how quickly they're able to act is the voter education too. not knowing what system we're going to end up with disallows us from doing voter outreach and education as to how they're going to vote in November. So while I admire the kind of the discussions that we had in the past about doing it this way, I think for practical purposes, this one election cycle, and again, it's only with 2 candidates, right? So it's not impacting 3 as it would in a typical cycle, is a good compromise.
Yeah, I mostly brought it up to see whether or not there was a new perspective or a new rationale, and it seems that there's not. So I agree with what seems to be the sense of the room, that we did consider these arguments before, and it's a compromise, and it's not ideal, but it is what it is.
Right. Is there any other discussion on this point?
Mr.
Okay.
Chair, if I may, and there's an ancillary point where we've spoken in the past, in fact, Jody brought it up today with regards to the outreach that the city clerk's office does during the elections process. I wanted to point out 2 things. One, to share with you the outreach that we did in the 2014 program. And I'll pass this around. And this is just a timeline that shows what we would do to support this type of a change. About a third of you, sorry, 2/3 of you have seen this. This is something that we have reviewed before when you were in the previous Charter Review Committee. So I'll pass this around just as.
Rod, was there something special in 2014, or was this like a new outreach program? Or did we change something in the way we elected in 2014?
No, in 2014, we decided to pilot something called the Democracy Santa Clara
Okay,
program.
but it wasn't a change in the way we elect.
It was not the way we change in the way we elect. At the time, though, we were trying to address moving over to actually proactively engaging people from emerging minority communities, engaging people in manners that were much more robust in a number of different mediums, and social medias. And in addition to these programs that we will do again in the next election cycle, it's important to note that in the last election cycle, Jennifer Yamaguma from the city manager's office was the primary lead. Jennifer Yamaguma, for my money, is one of the smartest people that we are ever going to meet in any place, way, shape, or form. And she's is responsible as the city's, I think it's the community relations manager, for having dramatically built up the city's social media presence. At the time in 2014, the city did not have somebody who was actively managing those resources for the city manager's office, or the city for the most part, although I believe that the police department did have a pretty solid presence already. So what you would likely see in future years would be a program similar to this, with a social media presence overlaying all that. You'll see Nextdoor and a few e-Notify and things like that. And now, of course, we're on Facebook and Twitter and I think Nixle, all the rest of those. So you would likely see something like that occur as well. Additionally, if you're doing it for something as significant as actually changing a voting method, the city may want to consider also actually hiring a professional firm to be able to help with some of that process, which is something that the city manager's office has broached as a topic already. So I'll simply say that to all of you so that you know, from both the city clerk's office elections official kind of content voter side, and from the city manager's communication side, which have been some of the most powerful partnerships that we've seen, we're ready to be able to implement any system that they want in a manner that we can engage voters as well as possible. I'll share with you also that this program won a thing called the PIGA Award, the Program Excellence and Governance Award. It's the top award you can win in the city clerk profession for programmatic honor in the world. No other city's won it more than once. We've won it 3 times here. So we take voter and community engagement pretty seriously. There is much more to that. So if anybody here who has not received, in fact, would anybody here who has not received that presentation like me to outreach to them, to give them the full presentation that I give to the folks who are on the previous Charter Review Committee, or is that not of interest? I take that this is adequate, so if...
Well, I thought we agreed that we would address this in a future session where we would come back to this, and then we would reach out and I would recommend that those who haven't gone through the program, that they discuss a time to meet with the city clerk. That makes sense to me, but I thought we agreed we would postpone that decision for another meeting or 2 down the road.
That is fine with me if that's the pleasure of the chair and of the body.
Yeah, but you know, I've gone through it. I think a lot of us here have gone through it. It's a fantastic program. It's you know, received numerous accolades and awards. So just from I think just when you look at the level of professionalism and how it's done, I think it lends confidence to the fact that if we do have to make changes, that we will do more than adequate job in making that happen. Jody?
May I ask a quick, oh, sorry. No, I just had a quick question about this. Rod, what was the overall impact on this as far
Getting
as?
way off the Brown Act topic here.
Oh,
Yeah, that's what I would like to do is to come back and get it in a little more detail once we get some of this stuff kind of done. And then we'll come back and that's a great question. We'll put it on the agenda and then we can dig a little bit deeper and maybe even do some brainstorming if we have time, if that's okay with you, Marcus.
yeah.
Okay. Jody?
I wanted to go back to the charter changes, just to get back to that and hopefully finish it up. Because you're going to rewrite this section on 700.2, but one thing that you didn't cover in there that I want to suggest that you might want to cover is what happens if the registrar isn't ready to go to ranked choice voting in 2020. They said they are, but you've got language in here, and I know you're going to rewrite it, but you've got language in here that says 2018 this is going to happen, in 2020 this is going to happen, and you may just want to have a sentence in there that says, or as soon as the registrar of voters is ready for it.
Yeah, I took that from
Yeah, he actually.
having this effective date
Okay,
language. I was going to wrap that into that.
great.
Yeah.
And since they'll be able to do it by ordinance, then they'll be able to finesse that. Having it being a directive to the city council, they'll know whether it's possible or not, and then they'll be able to do it at the next election that they can do it at.
Right, but I think in the ballot, in the charter language, you were going to say, we want to go to ranked choice voting, but I don't think we can give a date. I think it needs to be by this date or as soon as possible.
I think
Right.
that's
No,
what
I got
Hassan
that.
brought up, and then I think we captured it as contingencies.
Right.
Good, thank you.
Right, it has to be contingent upon the ability to do it and such.
Right.
Okay, great. Is there anything, go ahead, Jody, is there anything
was
else? Okay, so where we're at in the meeting, thank you all. This was a very good discussion.
Sorry,
I thought we
sorry,
got through it.
Keno, sorry. So
there
will the
more?
tie, how tie breaks, because we said we were going to discuss it in this section, that's going to be part of the ordinance then?
That will
Breaking
be in the
ties.
ordinance.
Yes,
Okay.
it's not going to be put in the charter. Yeah,
Thank
that's what we agreed to, sorry. Okay, so great job getting through this. It was a lot, but it was good discussion. So we have a choice.
Are we making a motion on the things that we asked Brian to come back and revise, or we don't need to make a motion?
I don't think we need to make a motion. I think it was just, we were just advising. We're not really, we would probably make a motion to approve the language, but since the language is still contingent upon
That's fine.
our recommendations, I think we'll probably make that motion and public comment and everything else when we're ready to vote, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Okay, so,
So we'll be coming back at another meeting to approve new language?
Yep.
Okay.
yep, because then we would make the formal recommendation to council, and that's what we would put forth.
And we're
then,
going to schedule that meeting
Yep.
tonight? Okay.
I don't know if we'll schedule it tonight. I have to check with Rania, because she's the schedule guru. So, okay. So you want to do it tonight? You want to schedule the next meeting tonight? Just as far as date and time, then you can let us know location after, or?
Sure. I mean, we can definitely.
I'm sorry?
And
Yeah, okay. So to be mindful of time, I think the next item on the agenda was to go to future work plans, but we're running upon 8:30. So the question is, and I want to make sure we get to public comment. So the question is, do we want to start having the discussion and make a motion to adjourn the meeting at, say, 9 o'clock to start a discussion on the police chief? The conversion of police chief to be appointed by council, or do we want to table it and just start off fresh at the next meeting? Keith?
I guess I have two comments. One is, we at our last meeting added 2 items to be discussed at our next meeting, which
Okay.
was not converting the police chief or the city clerk to be appointed, but to, and the mayor, but to consider using a ranked choice method of electing those 3 offices, which
Yeah.
is not on this list.
Right. I would,
Agenda item number 5.
yeah, I was making the assumption that anything and everything was open when we're discussing the police chief, mayor, and city clerk, that this is just kind of a guideline, but.
So my first is, I just didn't want those to get forgotten.
Yep, okay.
Because they weren't included in the paper we talked about.
just wanted to,
And
can I just make some comments just about this, this list that's provided in front of you? So the Ethics Committee did meet in August and had recommended that we seek input from the community about suggestions for future work plan items. And so the list before you, these items were received from the community. And committee members are welcome to also provide suggestions as well. So.
Right, and I understand that. I mean, I wish our items had been on the list because we put them there and they got dropped.
My understanding
So
of the
I'm
idea.
not, what I was going to say is I'm not sure if we can talk about those because they
No,
were.
I don't think you can talk about any of them. I think tonight, all we're doing is forming the work plan. And then I think the idea is to report the work plan back to the city council for them to
No.
decide.
I say it differently. It says review suggested future work plans. This is the suggested future work plan, and we have the right to discuss this. This isn't adding more to the list. This is an actual discussion of that list. Now, we can add more to that list based on what I've talked to the Ethics Committee, that if there's something else that this committee wanted to discuss, we could add that to the list, just like any citizen could add it to the list. But based on my understanding of what this is review suggested future work plans, and a review is just that. It's to review what's being presented to us.
I think you can say, do we want to have a presentation and a discussion of this at a future committee meeting? But I don't think you should really be, we're not prepared at all to give you any pluses and minuses, ins and outs of any of these things tonight in terms of a substantive discussion.
Yeah, well,
if you don't mind, I think what Tino's
I
saying,
think
because
my understanding of
we're not going to
was-
discuss any of these things and come to conclusion today on any of them anyways. My
Right,
point
right.
is that Tino's not requesting for permission from council to discuss these items once
No.
we distill them. I think as a committee, we're going to discuss the items that we feel necessary, given the input from the Ethics Committee, given the items that we wanted to discuss the last time we met.
And the community.
And the community through the input of the Ethics Committee. And we'll just discuss them and then make a recommendation to City Council. We don't need to seek their permission to give them a recommendation in the future. I think that's what you're trying to say, Tino.
Yeah, well, sort of. I hear what this city attorney is saying, and if I'm hearing you correctly, you're saying that you're not ready to give us any sort of insight on any of these matters 1 through 4, that you're not prepared to do that tonight. But what I'm suggesting is that we don't necessarily, for the most part, need expertise from the city manager or city attorney to start a discussion. The real question is, do we want to start the discussion and have a half an hour discussion till 9 o'clock? Or do we want to have public presentation and then table this and start fresh at the next meeting? And that's really what I'm asking. So
I'm just not sure it's agendized correctly for that type of substantive discussion.
Well,
Typically when the agenda says review work plan items, it's simply to set the work plan. It's not to actually discuss those items. So it's not just a question of us being prepared. It's a question of notice to the public whether they're prepared to give their input even on any kind of substantive discussion of the items.
okay.
But I'm not going to say, I think it is worthwhile to go through them and say, do we want this on the work plan or not? And to the extent that involves some level of a substantive discussion, it would just be with an eye towards not making any conclusive determination without getting, a lot more thorough input in the future.
Okay. So I disagree with that point of view, but the real question is, this may be a moot point because if people want to end at 8:30, then we're splitting hairs and there's no real reason to do it. Jody, and then Teresa, and then Keith.
Well, I personally did just a little bit of research on some of these items, and I think what I came to was that there was going to be a lot of questions, a lot of things that we were going to need more information on. So what I saw tonight as being, and I think we did something similar to this at the beginning of this whole round, was let's brainstorm what kind of information do we think we would need in order to talk about these items, about whether or not we want to convert them to appointed or whether we want to convert them to ranked choice. What kind of information would we need for those? Like for the chief of police, I think there's some information that I would want to get that you could gather for us so that we have more information. And I don't want to wait until the next meeting to say, oh, but, it would really help us if we had, such and such. So would it be possible for us at this meeting to sort of brainstorm what information do we need to go forward on the discussion?
It doesn't make sense to me because the city attorney is not prepared to give us any of that information, so we
Right,
maybe
no, no,
ask
I'm not
him.
saying he's going to give it to, give
creating
us
a
the
list of
information,
what
but,
we want from them.
yeah,
So-
give him a list of what information he should gather before the next meeting, so he can come prepared.
So what I'd like to do is, again, if we're going to continue, we need a motion. So I want to,
To continue the meeting until 9 o'clock, including public presentation.
okay,
Second that.
all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, great. So going back to what Jody's saying, I think Keith made it and Hossam seconded it. So, okay, so I got what you're saying, Jody. Teresa?
Rania had suggested that at the Ethics Committee meeting, you actually did get public comment from, and this list was compiled from some of the people in the community about things that they would like us to address. So I would like to see if it would be possible to make sure they understood that this Charter Review Committee is meeting, and those are going to be the agenda items in case they wanted to be able to give a presentation of why they thought that these were important issues for the city. So if they're on the agenda for the next meeting and it's possible to reconnect with the people that came to the Ethics Committee meeting, I think we should do that.
Okay, Mary? Oh, go ahead.
To clarify,
But this went out, right? Didn't this go out to the public?
yeah, so it was,
Right.
it was something that was sent.
This has already gone out.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the request for input was sent to the community via e-Notify, social media, and Twitter and such. And so that feedback was provided already, and this is a compilation. This is a summary of that feedback. So the
we've
task is
already
to prioritize.
We've already put it out there.
So I guess what I'm suggesting is if we're going to have these as an agenda item, it would be good before the discussion to let the community know that they're on the agenda in case people feel really strongly about some of the issues that we're going to be discussing.
But this was in the packet.
Yeah,
This was in the packet for this meeting that these were going, I mean, I'm not saying we have to, but I'm saying this already went out. We already sent this out saying these are the suggested items that this committee is going to be reviewing. And so this went out with all of the other information as far as they gathered the information from the public, and then they compiled it, put it in this document, sent out this document as part of the packet for the public if the public was interested in coming in. And so full disclosure is great. I mean, personally, I mean, all I'm saying is we could technically talk about some of these if somebody really had a burning desire, but for me personally, I mean, I think what Jody's saying is, let's figure out what we think we're going to need and prepare, and to be fully, to have full disclosure and transparency. Let's agendize it and send it out and let them know that we're going to start formally discussing the recommendations that came from the Ethics Committee and from the community. I have no problem with that. I just don't want to pigeon us to not being able to talk about anything on this, because I don't fundamentally think that's what this says. So, Mary, go ahead. Mary or Keith?
Well, to try to make it short, can I make a motion to add items to the agenda for our next meeting to happen within a month, to discuss the method of election for the remaining offices in Santa Clara, which mayor, city clerk, chief of police. And then I would, since we have requests from the public that were put in this agenda as agenda item number 5, to also discuss at a future meeting items 1, 2, 3, and 4 of agenda item number 5, which include, and I don't know who these came from the Ethics Committee but those 4 items.
No, skip 4. We just decided.
So did you want the method of voting for the chief of police, the city clerk, and the mayor? Because you only mentioned chief of police, so you want
No,
to
I
add.
said all elected offices,
Oh, okay,
including
I'm
the
sorry.
mayor,
I'm sorry.
the
Okay,
city
okay,
clerk.
sorry.
And, I mean, specifically, I think what we said last time was to use ranked choice to elect those 3 offices.
Yeah, we had started talking about
We had, and I would,
the feasibility of doing it,
since,
so we can add it.
since we've asked for that to be on the agenda and it wasn't on the agenda, I ask for it to be on the next agenda. I ask for items 1, 2, and 3 to be in the next agenda, since item 4, I guess, has been covered.
So let me go, I'm sorry, go ahead, Keith. I thought you were done.
Going down, there are other comments received, 5 through 10, which I suspect you or someone said we don't think those are appropriate in the city charter, or some reason that they weren't included under suggested future work items.
Yeah, I mean, they're listed as other comments because, yes, they.
Can you use the mic?
They are listed as other comments received because, yes, these items don't relate to the city charter.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I am not a lawyer, and I concur that to me, the majority of those items are not appropriate for a charter amendment. I do think the charter could indicate whether planning commission appointments should exclude people in real estate. I personally wouldn't support that, but I mean, I think you could rationally put that in a charter and people could vote on it and it could be adopted. Plausibly, you could come up with something in the charter for items 9 and 10. I can't think of language I would support for them, but if the intention of charter review was to respond to requests from the community, I think some of those items could be addressed in some way in the charter. And my last item is, when I think back to the original first city council meeting where they discussed having a charter review committee, and then when they appointed it, and I went back and watched the parts of those meetings, the city council also said, essentially, and any other items the charter review committee wants to talk about in the charter. And we have never been able to put that on the agenda, right? We started, and the intention was to focus first on the method of elections because of the lawsuit and timing and such. But I would like some future meeting to include an agenda item where we could discuss other changes to the charter. I didn't read through the charter in the last couple of weeks. I did read through it after I was first appointed, and there were a couple things I drew question marks next to that I thought plausibly we could have some discussion on. And I would like to go back and find my piece of paper buried somewhere in my office, so that I could look at those again and see whether I thought there were other things in our charter that could be changed.
Correct. Steve?
As a point of clarification, both Keith and I went to the Ethics Committee meeting. None of these suggestions came up at the Ethics Committee. The only thing they said was, hey, we should see if the Charter Review Committee wants to talk about anything else.
That's
so
right.
I don't want to give anybody the impression that these were directed issues. Not surprisingly, I'm prepared to give you a whole history on why we have an elected chief and the pluses or the minuses to having that. And I look forward to giving that as well. And finally, to Keith's point, I mean, when you look at, items 5 about police traffic motorcycles and, number 8, the high density, I think we really need to guard against going beyond our mission scope here as a charter review committee. We're not the city council. We started with a very specific mission of looking at the elections. We're going beyond that mission a little bit now. I'm not sure that's really what we are supposed to be doing. If you look back at other charter review committees, they were very specific. Do we need a stadium? Do we need other specific things? And to the point that Keith makes about and any other thing, I think we need to guard against that, or else 2 years from now, we're going to celebrate our 2-year anniversary here. We're going to continue to be here. So that's my thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you. Mary?
I think piggybacking off of both Keith and Steve, I do think that we should put on an agenda in the future, an opportunity to suggest other areas to look at in the charter. But I think Steve's right. We're not going to take them all on.
No.
We can prioritize them. We can figure out if there are any. I mean, it may be that we all think about that, and other than this methods of election piece for the other elected officials, we decide we don't think we should change anything else about the charter right now because, you know,
That's right.
one is enough. But I do think that we really need a chance for us as a committee to offer more suggestions. And I think one way we did it in the previous charter review was to email them in between so that they could actually end up in the packet. That might be a good idea. It may also be better to have an open discussion. I'm not sure. I would leave that probably to the chair and vice chair to sort of figure out. But I do think that there's an opportunity for other places. And I know that council, I mean, I just feel like there's an opportunity for us to make sure that if there are obsolete sections or things that could be more clear or things that could be updated, it's time.
Okay. Hassan?
First, I'll get my mic on. I think Keith made a motion, and I think it's a good motion that we should focus on the other 3 elected positions, whether or not we should, it's not on this paper, it's what we discussed in our last meeting. The other 3 elected positions, whether or not we would change them to also follow suit with our recommendation for ranked choice voting. I think we should definitely focus on that from a time perspective right away so that it all goes together hand in hand with how we elect our council members. I agree with that. I also agree that the 3 issues that are listed on this suggested future work plan are probably top of mind amongst members of the community. Whether you agree with them or not, that's something we can probably debate as a committee. On the point that Jody made, which is asking city staff for more information. Number 7, I would probably abstract that and ask city staff if they can give us any sort of information about what laws with regarding to conflict of interest exist in the city today. Are those laws in the charter? Are those laws enacted by city ordinance? And that's something we can come back.
I can tell you the answer right now. It's in state code. There's no reason for the charter to deal with this
Right.
issue at all.
Okay, so if that's the feedback then that we can get, then maybe I just lost my.
I mean,
screen.
I think these are just things people sent in, like maybe there was
Yeah, I
one
understand.
email on all
I understand.
this.
I mean,
so I don't
again,
think you have any duty to necessarily
Address them
consider
one by
that-
one. I understand.
I don't think you have any duty to address them at all if you don't think they
understand.
belong in a charter review committee.
I understand. I was just asking that if the answer is as easy as you just stated it was, then we're done with that, in my opinion. There's also a couple items that that are not on this list that we discussed many months ago that I think is relevant for our committee to discuss, and that is regarding campaign finance laws and what can we do in our charter to protect our city from negative external influences like dark money. I think that's something that is worth exploring on our work plan. And then the last one would be in relation to that, what sort of, and maybe this is not a charter thing, maybe it's an ordinance thing, what kind of, aside from the dark money, what sort of campaign finance rules are in place for elected office? So again, this has nothing to do with external influences. This is campaign finance rules for candidates running in the city. So it's not talking to external forces like in dark groups, but this is talking about, our own candidates. What kind of expenditure limits are there? I know we have the voluntary ethics program that people can sign up for and that sort of thing. I don't know if that's relevant for a charter, but that's just some things that we had discussed in the past, and we can debate whether or not it's relevant for the charter. So I don't know if you made the motion, or I would second that motion if you made it.
Can I make a comment before you make?
Yeah.
Just that you're talking about whether the other 3 elected offices, whether or not they should go to ranked choice voting. And we don't have very much time until the election, but I do think we need to, I do think we need to talk about first whether or not we want any of those to become appointed before we talk about the election method, because you could spend hours talking about the election method and then decide that one of them should be appointed. and you've kind of wasted your time. So it seems to me the decision about whether they should be elected or appointed needs to be made, needs to be had before you decide what the election method should be.
Turn your mic. Thank you.
Good, Keith.
So I think I know I said a fair amount, and then other people have said stuff. So I'm going to shorten my motion, and maybe we can all vote on that, and then I'll have a second motion. So my first motion is for the next meeting to have a discussion about the remaining 3 at-large seats in the city and their election method, and include whether, and include a discussion about whether they should remain elected positions. Period.
Second.
Is there any further discussion on Keith's particular motion, Steve?
Yes.
Yep.
We were created as a charter review committee to specifically talk about election methods and then other stuff that they threw in there. I think that our best time is spent going back to council saying, here's 3 or 4 other things that people have mentioned that they may want to talk about. Do you, as the governing body of the city of Santa Clara, city council, want us to chat about that and make recommendations? If you don't, then we're all wasting time here. So I would like to go back to the council and say, do you want us to talk about these things or not?
To that end, I mean, we presented our recommendation to the council at 1 in the morning or midnight. And they directed staff to work to codify this part, and they directed charter review to go back and discuss it after staff talked about it, and to discuss other things as we thought was appropriate. So I think they've already said that at the last meeting where they considered our recommendations. They also said that at the first meeting where they said, we would like you to talk about methods of elections and about other things that you think need to be changed in the charter. And then lastly, I think the election of the mayor and the city clerk and the police chief are election methods, the elections of the city of Santa Clara. And I think it is weird for us to draw a line and say, because we are being sued, the only thing we are going to talk about is something that could directly respond to that lawsuit.
Well, clearly that's why we were convened, is because of the suit. Well, I'll come back to that point in just a sec. But that's why the Charter Review Committee of 2017 was brought together, was to talk about that issue. My concern is, as you'll recall, when you were chaired 2 charter review committees before, we made, were you chair or vice chair?
I was not chair.
Anyway, they made recommendations about changing charter, and the city council said, thank you very much for your valuable input and all the work you've done, and we're going to table all of your recommendations. So if they're not interested in what we're talking about, I would like to get direction from them as to what they'd like us to talk about, rather than we spend a lot of time talking about stuff and making recommendations for stuff that they're not interested in. It's just my thought.
They just gave us direction in our last meeting.
So let's not confuse 2 things here. One thing is we have a motion to discuss at our next meeting the method of voting on the remaining elected positions and whether or not they should or should not report to council. That's your motion. That's what you've said. Should they be elected or not? And if they should be elected, what's the method? That's basically what you're saying. So let's stop the conversation about additional charter review, and we'll come back to that. So is there any other discussion on Keith's motion, which is simply to discuss the remaining positions of chief, city manager, city clerk, and mayor? Okay. So all those in favor of Keith's motion?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, Steve. All right. Now, as far as there's a lot of discussion here, and I appreciate what Steve is saying, because he's saying let's not waste our time. Point well taken. The other piece of it, though, is that I think there's an expectation that this charter would look at additional items in the charter, that this committee would look at additional items in the charter and make appropriate recommendations if everybody agreed that they would send it to council. There's one of two ways of looking at this. One is we could come up with a list of things that we think are important, and we can ask council, would you like us to discuss these? And if council comes back and says, no, we don't want you to discuss these, we're not going to worry about those things, then we have our answer. The other piece is we could simply say that we're going to discuss these things and we're going to make these recommendations to council. And at that point in time, council can say yay or nay. But what I want to make sure we do is, one way or another, I want to make sure that council is aware of what we're talking about, right? Because there may be stuff that they're not aware of that this charter is going to bring to their attention. And so, I agree with our we were initially supposed to look at voting methodologies, but I also agree that they wanted us to once again look at the entire charter. And, the truth of the matter is that the last time we convened, we didn't even get through all of it, right? Because there was so much. So I do think there's a need to look at it again. I think there's a valid reason to look at it again for what it's worth. But what I don't want to do, and what I want to be clear of, is that I don't want to look at, and again, you guys can decide, but I want to be careful that we don't look at things that should be an ordinance versus something in the charter. For instance, I think what Hussam's saying makes perfect sense, right? Dark money has complicated our elections in Santa Clara. Whether regardless of your opinion of it, there's a lot of folks in the city that don't appreciate it. Either side. But I don't know that that's really what the charter we should be talking about. I think those are ordinances that the city council should look at. But putting that in the charter necessarily, I don't know that that's really what we were necessarily asked to do. So I want to be clear that if we look at anything in the charter, it has to be related to what's in the charter now, or it has to be a clear-cut 110%, this should be in the charter, and everybody should agree for the most part that it should be in the charter. And then we can have that discussion. But campaign financing and so on and so forth, motorcycle cops, high-density housing. I mean, this is what the public is concerned about, okay? This is their concerns. And I respect these, right? I mean, I've heard these time and time, and this is nothing new. It's the same old that we're trying to fix. But it's not related to what we're doing. It's really related to having a discussion as to what the council should either make an ordinance or deal with, or whatever the case is. So I would say that Steve, we should be open to looking at the charter, but I think we need to be, as you said, and I would agree with you, we need to be very, very precise on what it is we're looking at and making sure, and I would take direction from the city attorney if it's something that we should look at from a charter perspective or not. For instance, I think probably, as the city attorney said, we really don't have to look at formally any of these. They're just suggestions. But I think we want to make sure that we get through the voting methodology for those three positions. And then what I would like to do is to have people come back with, if there's anything in the charter that they think should be amended or looked at, we should have a meeting where we can send those, and the city attorney can look at that and say, is it relevant to this charter committee or is it not? Is this more of an ordinance kind of thing? Or, 6 through 10, arguably we could, we look at the planning commission, and sure, most people would say that's kind of a conflict of interest, but is it a charter or is it an ordinance, right? And so I just want to be real careful that we're not trying to throw stuff into the charter that's really an ordinance, if that makes sense.
To that end, the second motion is I make a motion to consider or to accept from the public and members of the Charter Review Commission at our next meeting a list of remaining items to talk about in the city charter so that we can have a brief brainstorming session next time. And if we think we would like to talk about those other items, we can then ask staff to prepare a presentation to be talked about at a future charter review meeting. And I would like, I'm not sure if it's appropriate to say motion. I would like to put an end date on this. Kind of, you know, the expectation is that we are going to wrap up before December 31st, 2017, or November 30th, or whatever date it is.
or much earlier. So why don't we, that's
Well, I mean,
a-
we are midway through September. If drafting charter changes is a couple weeks, we are talking October for our next meeting. If we generally have a 2 or 3 week thing, right, we have maybe 3 more meetings before the end of December.
Right. So let's split that motion because that's it's a little bit complicated to have
Okay,
all of it in
so
one.
I'm gonna leave that second half
So
off.
let's do the end date, make a separate motion for the end date. So
At our next meeting, anyone on the Charter Review Commission that has anything else in the charter that they would like to discuss here, to be prepared to present that or to circle it. Hey, I would like to talk about section 714. And specifically this part of section 714. I just said that because that's the one on the screen. I don't actually want to talk about 714.
And I just want to reemphasize, to the extent that you're actually talking about what's in the charter, I think that's a great idea, to focus on that
Yes.
rather than talk about
Things
ideas in the world that we might
specifically come back
remedy.
with sections of the current charter to be discussed at a future charter review meeting. And to agendize that for our next meeting so that we can then accept that and then maybe have one more meeting to go over that for realsies.
Can I ask for a clarification?
yeah, hold on. So before we have, unless it's to his motion.
It's
It's a
clarifying his
clarification of his
motion.
Yeah. Go ahead, Jody.
Because I'm not sure if, because Keith said, so everyone should come with their list of changes and with their comments about those changes, but I'm not sure that you can actually, like, if you agendize coming up with a list of what we want to talk about, you haven't agendized actually talking about section
I agree.
600.42 or
Next
whatever.
meeting, come with a list of things to talk about next meeting so that then staff can agendize those for the following meeting.
Right, so when you, the part of it that I was worried about was when you said, and come with some talking points about that, it needs to be pretty short.
Just more details to staff about what in this section you were thinking of.
Right, because you can't have the discussion about that section at the next meeting. You can only make decisions about which ones you want to go forward with.
And it would be more of a clarification of why the person thought it was important or of interest, and then there'd be clarifying questions from this committee, and then we would, if it made sense, and again, I would also want to solicit the opinion of the city attorney to make sure that this is something that is appropriate for the charter committee, or if it's appropriate for an ordinance, or if it doesn't make sense to talk about, you know, so I don't know what's going to be brought your way, but the goal is to focus on the charter, what's in the charter, and if anything needs to be amended or whatever the case is, it has to pertain to the charter. It has to fit into the charter in order for us to have that
I
discussion.
mean, I would assume that the exercise would be, I don't know if you all want to read the charter, but if you want to just generally look through it and see if there are, to me, the most useful thing for the Charter Review Committee to do would be to look at specific sections of the charter that they think should be changed, rather than think of ideas in the world.
That's what I think we're agreeing on doing.
I'm a little confused, so let me just, if I can ask Keith this to clarify. You're asking for members of the public and members of the committee next week, or next meeting, sorry, to bring forward their ideas to be put on a list that will be vetted by this team, not to be discussed at that meeting, but to be agendized for a future meeting. Does that list is exclusively for changes to the charter on items that are already in the charter, or can that list also include new ideas? Maker of the motion.
This is the maker of the motion.
Yes, I'm asking.
I mean,
because I know what Brian wants.
well, I've got 3 night meetings a month already, and then this one makes 4 if we do it only monthly. And to kind of go off onto, like, this is something I think should go into the charter, I think we're already way off into an
But that's
incredible.
something as a committee, we can debate whether we would even entertain it or not. I
Well,
mean,
yeah,
I just don't want to
think-
limit the
yeah,
motion to
I
that.
agree, but we need to, at some point, make concessions to the length of life and to the.
Understand.
to-
I
but-
just
but-
don't
but
want to
so-
limit
no,
what
what
we
I-
can
can
bring
I-
to the next meeting. That's all.
What I'm saying is, we hear you, we have a very full agenda for the next time, we have the language that's coming back on the thing you've already voted on. We have the 3 new items, the 3 other elected offices, and then we have, what I'm hearing as the motion is a discussion of the future work plan.
Yeah.
Basically, that's it.
That's it. And during that discussion, what I would expect is that, you know, if we are in left field and it's not pertaining to the charter, that the city attorney or city clerk or anybody else would come in and say, that's probably not appropriate for this discussion.
Right.
It's a great idea for an ordinance, right? And I would ask that we be critical of each other, to be very focused. It's not personal. It's just a matter of, as Steve said, you know, there has to come a point in time when we no longer convene, and I think Keith also said the same thing. So in order to do what I think needs to be done next, I think we need to be very narrow in what we propose so we can put forth something that makes sense, that's relevant to the charter, but that we get it done in a reasonable amount of time. Because the truth of the matter is, as you know, I mean, our council meetings go on until 2 o'clock in the morning, and, you know, we all work. I mean, we're all tired. I'm tired. Everybody's tired in this room. I mean, we all work 8, 10 hours a day. So if there's any other discussion with Keith's,
I'll second his motion so we can vote on
okay,
it.
and is there any other discussion? Is there any other concern?
Chair Silva, may I ask for a clarification?
Yeah, go ahead, yeah.
And it was primarily regarding Mr. Hagag's
Yeah.
request that we bring information with regards to campaign finance reform. I'm happy to give
No,
you
no,
a
that
very
was,
thorough.
no, that was not part of the
No,
motion.
no, not,
Okay, that is.
but thank you.
No, well, I'm not requesting to do so. It was more pointing out that that's handled by ordinance.
Yeah, exactly.
So if that, I'm more than happy to give any member of the committee or the public a review, but it is currently handled by ordinance rather than in the city charter.
Yep, thank you. Okay, is there any other discussion? Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Marcus, you're opposed, so there's 1 opposed. And Steve? The motion is that we're going to, we are going to come back next meeting with recommendations to the charter, specifically to the charter, that we would like to put forth, and then agendize the next meeting so people in the public would know what part of the charter this group decided to look at and review. In a nutshell, is that what I'm hearing?
Yes.
Okay. So all we're doing is bringing ideas. This group will clarify the ideas, and we'll do one of 2 things. Either say, no, it's not for the scope of this charter committee and we don't want to talk about it, or it is in the scope of the charter review committee, and we will talk about it. And we will go to council if we're not quite sure if it's an ordinance or a charter review, and we'll take, you know, the input from council as to whether or not we should be discussing that. And we'll do is we'll agendize it for the next one. I would argue that we're probably only going to have time to do possibly maybe 1 or 2. So we may have to go through and take all the recommendations and do what we did at our last charter review, which is to rank choice vote. And so we can practice what we preach. But we'll probably at some point have to take 5 or 6 probably good ideas and narrow it down to the 2 that we really want to focus on, and then go from there. But hopefully Keith will make a motion, another motion to, you know, when this charter review has to be done, when we're hoping that it's going to be done.
I am, how about we'll do that at the next meeting? And then lastly, I'd make a motion to extend the meeting until 9:15 and to begin public presentations at the end of the meeting.
Okay, that's
Upon
fine.
the completion of this motion.
Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, so on the next agenda, we also have to agendize that we're going to discuss how long we are going to continue to meet. So if we can put that on as an agenda item. It shouldn't be, guys, it shouldn't be a hard conversation. I mean, yes, less is good. Okay. Public presentation, is there anything else from this group? Any other clarification? Nothing? Okay, great. Are you comfortable, Steve? You got it? Okay, so Pedro, if you want to come on up, we'll give you 3 minutes. Is it 2 minutes for final? Okay, we'll give you 2 minutes. Can you do it in 2? I'll tell you later.
Just wanted to quickly add a couple things. The reason why we keep reiterating on the bottoms-up ranked choice voting method is that we also see that there might be an opportunity for the ROV to lease equipment from the city of Oakland as well, or the Alameda ROVs, since I think that city of Oakland the county of Alameda is looking to get new equipment for the 2018 election. So that's something that, you know, the Alameda or the Santa Clara ROV should look into. And we also think that's really important for voter experience to have the ranked choice voting method for them to get acclimated. And I think the part that was left out of the conversation is that when you use ranked choice voting to elect two people, the threshold for one person to become elected or those two seats is 33%. Just wanted to make sure that that was out there because we'd like to see an opportunity for the you know, political minorities to have an opportunity to get elected and have a voice in the city council. Just, you know, let me know if you have questions about the model statute language. We're available as a resource, and thank you all for all your work this evening.
Thank you. Question?
Real quick question. Does it require a county ordinance change to lease that equipment from another county to do the voting methods? I mean, I don't know.
No. Steve's telling me no. What I understand for Alameda County is that their equipment's already been certified and already has that RCV upgrade.
Okay.
Is also what I wanted to add to that.
I was just thinking that the method of voting is by ordinance in the county. I just wondered if it needed a change to do this other thing.
No.
Lease this equipment. No.
Yeah. Yes, this equipment.
Thank you.
Yes.
And Steve, to answer your question, I mean, from when our charter review, the registrar of voter came in and said, Santa Clara is under no requirement to use the county. We use the county because the county has a registrar of voters and we pay the money and they do all of it. The city can contract out with someone else to count our votes. The city could do it itself. We could hire employees. We could open polling places. We could print our own ballots. I mean, there's no requirement that we use the county, but it's much cheaper to use the county, and so we do.
So, okay. Steve?
Okay, Pedro presented you with a short form and a long form. Now, we haven't discussed the issue of certification of equipment. And it's not clear to me that putting the language for STV in an ordinance is enough for the Secretary of State to certify equipment as capable of conducting an STV election. The Secretary of State said that Santa Clarita couldn't use cumulative voting because there was no statutory definition of cumulative voting. Now, a city charter has the force of state law. They get chaptered just like statutes passed by the legislature get chaptered. In his letter to the Santa Clarita, the Secretary of State said that because San Francisco had in their charter, because Oakland had in their charter the definition of single winner ranked choice voting, he was able to come up with regulations to certify equipment by, to do the testing protocols. So if you do not specify that in your charter, now maybe the Secretary of State will be okay by saying, well, the charter says it's in the ordinance, and the ordinance says this, and that's good enough. But you really need to have, unless you want your city clerk to hand count your ballots, you really need to have a conversation with the Secretary of State to determine if an ordinance is good enough for them to come up with regulations for certifying equipment for STV. The county is going to make sure that the equipment is, that is capable of conducting an STV election, but it might not be certified for an STV election if you don't have the language in your charter that says what STV is. So that's something for you to consider. And I would have said that at the beginning of your discussion if your rules would have allowed me to say that. But your rules do not allow me to say that. So you had to spend much of your time having a discussion that I think frankly wasted a lot of your time.
And you are given 2 chances to present to the public, not just one. So I think we're doing an adequate job of giving you an opportunity to speak, which is why we give you
Oh, yeah.
time in the beginning and
I
time in the end.
appreciate that, but I'm concerned about your time.
Yeah, well,
You spend a good half hour discussing ordinance or charter, ordinance or charter, ordinance or charter.
Right.
And I think that if I had been able to say what I just said at the beginning of that discussion, you would have said, oh, well, we don't need to spend half an hour to do this. We have a homework assignment for the city clerk and the city attorney to talk to the Secretary of State and the registrar of voters to determine whether or not we can do it by ordinance.
and he can still do that.
You can still do that.
Thank you.
but You could end the meeting half
Okay,
hour earlier.
Dave.
In addition to the ordinance or charter, and if it's stuff is in the charter, having to put all the details in there, another question is over what exceptions can be made to that. I mean, actually, the San Francisco charter language was the first of the various things for using instant runoff voting. And I think that actually the Oakland and Berkeley charter provisions did a better job. In particular in Oakland, it has all the detailed procedures in there, and then also has something saying that exceptions could be made in various circumstances by the city clerk for various reasons, among others, if there's a state law providing for instant runoff voting to follow its procedures, even if they're different from the ones specified in the charter. Something along those lines probably should be in there, that if it's referred to an ordinance, to say that it also could instead be referred to a state law if a provision in the state law provides for STV at some time in the future, that it can follow that rather than some slightly different thing that the council may put into an ordinance.
Thank you, Dave. Is there any more public comment?
Motion to adjourn.
Second?
Oh,
In
wait,
favor?
Wait, next meeting date. I forgot.
I think it may be better that I coordinate this
Yeah.
via email, because we need to also sync up with Brian's availability.
Okay.
So would we prefer to meet in
Within
2
like a
weeks,
month,
if at all
or-
possible? So would we prefer to meet in 2 weeks if
I'd
it's
prefer
possible?
2 weeks so we can get it done with.
Is there anybody have an issue with that? Okay. Okay. Well, we'll do the best we can. Okay. So there's a motion second to adjourn. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you.
Okay, instead of districts 1 and 2, districts 17 and 18. Just to make